Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. As Cheryl said, it's my first time in Australia as well as Sydney, and it's been a wonderful trip. And I just also wanted to thank everyone for wearing masks, and I would second the points that Cheryl made on this. It's really I think it's an extraordinary fact that this event and the meeting in San Diego are virtually unprecedented in the entire experience of the pandemic. And I think the refusal of capitalist world governments as well as the World Health Organization to really explain airborne transmission and the need for wearing N95 masks, for ventilation, for HEPA filters. It's really it's one of the greatest crimes that's been committed over the course of the pandemic, and especially in the past year, and the efforts to denigrate masking and to discourage their use. And now, as we're seeing most recently, the lifting of requirements in healthcare settings throughout the world. And I think I just wanted to begin by really stressing that contrary to the lies of capitalist world governments and even the World Health Organization, the pandemic is nowhere near over. According to The Economist tracker of excess deaths, there have now been 22 million deaths attributable to the pandemic globally. And at present, they estimate that there continue to be 11,500 excess deaths every day throughout the world, which amounts to another 1 million deaths every 3 months. And for the first time since World War II, life expectancy has declined globally during the first 2 years of the pandemic, and will likely decline again for 2022. And just recently, the World Health Organization noted that during the first 2 years of the pandemic, the world's population lost 337 million years of life. And by this point, that figure is now likely approaching 500 million. And in addition to the millions of lives lost, hundreds of millions of people are now grieving the loss of these loved ones. And then there's the mass disabling event of long COVID, which continues each day. There's a recent report led by Dr. Eric Topol in the United States at the Scripps Institute, and Hannah Davis, who's a leading long COVID advocate, which conservatively estimated that that there's at least 65 million people throughout the world who are likely suffering from long COVID, and the real figure is it's likely much higher, possibly in the hundreds of millions. And I think it's important to stress that there have been many other viruses and pathogens that cause sort of post-viral illness and lingering symptoms, but there's nothing like this in human history in terms of the scale of what we're seeing with long COVID. In the US, the CDC estimates that there's roughly 20 million people suffering from long COVID. And in our recent article, we note that in Australia, the Burnet Institute estimates that 500,000 adults are now suffering from long COVID here. And I just wanted to stress also that really, over the past, there's been a major shift over the past year and a half. And I think, the response of capitalist governments to the emergence of the Omicron variant has really been cold-blooded and catastrophic. Governments throughout the world seized on the emergence of this variant, which is highly infectious and vaccine resistant, to scrap basically whatever limited mitigation measures were still in place, and to embrace the herd immunity strategy that was initially identified with the far right. And I think one of the countries where this was expressed most sharply is here in Australia, where, as I'm sure everyone here knows, but Chief Medical Officer Paul Kelly said that Omicron could be his, quote, #1 Christmas present, end quote. And so due to the process of the past year, the scrapping of testing, contact tracing, we now have no accurate way to measure the real spread of the virus. But in countries where wastewater tracking is done, we can see that viral transmission remains far higher than during any of the lulls in between waves during 2020 and 2021. There's essentially a very high baseline of infections, and the virus is continuing to circulate. And just today, we published an article on the WSWS, which notes that China is now in the throes of the second major wave of the pandemic since they lifted the zero COVID elimination strategy last November. And on Monday, Dr. Zhong Nanshan, who played really a central role in crafting the zero COVID policy in China, announced that this latest wave, which is expected to peak in late June, is anticipated to infect upwards of 65 million people per week. And I think the warnings that really only the WSWS made about the lifting of zero COVID in China have been proven absolutely correct. When they did this, they basically repeated the lies of other capitalist governments that this would be a one-off event, that they would go through in what they called an exit wave, and then basically return to normal. And what we're seeing instead is that they've basically been integrated into this, dystopian reality of perpetual mass infection, repeated waves of mass infection and death. Just in the first wave last winter, they estimate that at least 1 million people, potentially over 2 million, died in China in the space of just 3 months, which was one of the most, alongside the Delta wave in India, was the most concentrated wave of death during the pandemic. And now many more thousands will likely perish in the coming weeks. The dangers of viral evolution are ongoing. Every principled virologist in the world would agree that at any point, a far more dangerous variant could evolve. And in fact, in recent weeks, there's been a number of statements to that effect. Just a couple weeks ago, Deborah Birx, who is the first COVID response coordinator under Trump in the US, said that in the coming months, she anticipates that Paxlovid will no longer be effective if there's when a new variant emerges that basically renders it ineffective. And so despite all the propaganda, the pandemic is ongoing and it remains very dangerous. And I think in this context, this book, COVID, Capitalism, and Class War, is immensely relevant. This is volume 1 of what will be a multi-volume series on the pandemic, compiling all of the most critical statements, polemics, interviews with scientists, statements by the different national sections of the ICFI, and other material that's been produced by the World Socialist website throughout the pandemic. And really the greatest challenge in editing this book was selecting what to include and what to leave out. As Cheryl said, we've now published over 6,000 articles on the pandemic since January 2020. And this is a 400-page volume, which includes just 81 of the most essential statements that we've written from throughout the world. And I wanted to stress that it really is the product of the collective effort of hundreds of comrades in the ICFI from throughout the world, writers, editors, proofreaders, comrades involved in producing the website, the production staff. It's been really an immense collective effort from our international movement. And really no other political party or news outlet in the world, in particular among those on the pseudo left, has even remotely come close to this record. As Cheryl said, the majority of the pseudo left tendencies greeted the pandemic with indifference, wrote barely anything in the first few months, in the first year, and essentially treated it as a non-event. And I think really to understand why the ICFI responded to the pandemic, unlike any other tendency, one has to examine this book in connection to what Dave has spoken of in relation to his book, Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century. And I think this book really represents the application of Marxism and Trotskyism to contemporary reality and an analysis of the world historic event of the pandemic. In the decades preceding the pandemic, the period during which the articles in Dave's book were published, it's important to understand that there was really a renaissance of Trotskyism within the ICFI, in particular, coming out of the split in 85 to 86. And really, since the 1980s, we are the only political party in the world which has comprehensively analyzed the nature of globalization, the financialization of the economy, the protracted degeneration of the trade unions, the unending and eruption of American imperialism after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the attacks on democratic rights and the threat of fascism, and efforts to really replace a scientific world outlook with the subjective irrationalism of postmodernism. And finally, the refusal of capitalism to scientifically address climate change or the growing threat of zoonotic spillover events. And if you go back and look at the coverage of the WSWS since it was founded in 1998, we've covered every new infectious disease outbreak that occurred during the first two. In particular, there was an uptick in the beginning of the 21st century, and really with each outbreak, SARS-CoV-1, MERS, H1N1, the Ebola, the Zika virus outbreak. We covered them. We covered each outbreak and really continuously warned that capitalism was totally unprepared for the growing threat of a catastrophic pandemic. And we understood that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, that the necessary response would be prevented by two essential elements of the capitalist system: the division of the world into rival nation states and the subordination of all social needs to private profit. And I think the focus of this book is on 2020, which I'm sure everyone here recalls very vividly. And in a sense, I think it's somewhat difficult to read this volume because one realizes the profound truth that had the warnings of the ICFI been heeded and been followed, the pandemic could have been stopped and millions of lives could have been saved throughout the world. The first article which we published on the pandemic, as Cheryl said earlier, was on January 24th, 2020, before there were even reports of cases in the US. And then just 4 days later, the WSWS published our first perspective statement. Both documents are in here. And I just wanted to quote a brief passage from that statement, which was again published on January 28, 2020, before most people really were even aware that this SARS-CoV-2 was spreading. And we wrote in the conclusion of that perspective, the short-term mercenary profit schemes that are inherent to capitalism are incapable of allocating the resources necessary to plan ahead and prepare for global risks. Rooted in the nation-state system, every capitalist country presses for its own advantage in the present while sacrificing the future, cutting across serious and scientifically necessary international collaboration. These conflicts are only escalating. At a time when rational planning across national borders is critical to combat the global spread of a virulent disease, the United States and China are locked in a growing trade conflict in what has been called a new Cold War. Even as new pathogens require the scientific resources of every continent to combat, the countries of the world are building metaphorical and literal walls. The defense of human civilization against the threat of global pandemics, just like climate change and the growing threat of ecological disasters, requires a level of planning and global cooperation of which capitalism is incapable. Society has outgrown the capitalist system and the arbitrary divisions it imposes on the world. The provision of the most existential social needs requires social planning. That is, it requires socialism. In the following month, in February 2020, the New York Times and virtually the entire corporate media internationally went silent on the pandemic. And in contrast, we continued to cover its development following the situation in China, in particular on the global spread of the virus. And let's see, on February 28, 2020, we published a critical statement by the ICFI, which was titled, "For a Globally Coordinated Emergency Response to the Pandemic." And this was published when there were just 100,000 official cases worldwide and nearly 3,000 deaths. And we outlined a comprehensive program which would have stopped the pandemic in its tracks. Just at one part, we say, in the first demand, global mobilization, we say, the response to the coronavirus cannot be coordinated on a nation-by-nation level. The virus does not respect borders or visa and immigration restrictions. The global networks of transportation and economic integration have turned the virus into a global problem. The solution must be global. Scientists from all over the world must be allowed to share their research and technology. unencumbered by the national interests and geopolitical conflicts that serve only to delay the development of effective countermeasures to contain, cure, and ultimately eradicate the coronavirus. And I think it's highly significant that in this statement, which again was published in late February 2020, the WSWS outlined a strategy to eradicate SARS-CoV-2. The volume has many similar statements from throughout the year in which we outlined a programmatic response to the pandemic at each stage of its development. We continuously analyzed the scientific development of the pandemic and the political crisis, and really in particular, the homicidal Back to Work campaign, and raised demands for the working class to assert its own independent interests in opposition to the homicidal policies of the capitalist governments, the corporations, and their lackeys in the trade unions. And one of these statements was directed to auto workers in the US, and it was read by thousands, I believe actually tens of thousands, and helped precipitate wildcat strikes, which led to the initial shutdown of the auto industry across North America. I just wanted to conclude really by stressing that the pandemic represents the most colossal breakdown of the world capitalist system since World War II. And one of the central concepts that we developed in April and May 2020 is that the pandemic is a trigger event in world history, akin to the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, which triggered the outbreak of World War I. And we foresaw at the time that the pandemic would profoundly accelerate the destabilization of world capitalism, and it would set the stage for the outbreak of an imperialist redivision of the world and the eruption of social revolution. And this was proven correct. The pandemic produced unprecedented labor shortages, caused a spiraling global economic crisis with massive inflation, which was further exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And it really set the stage for the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, which, as we've noted, is really the antechamber to World War III. And I think the criminal pandemic policies of every government have really exposed the brutality of capitalism, but it also has radicalized masses of workers throughout the world. We've seen a steady escalation of the class struggle over the past 2 years, which has now reached a fever pitch. And really, the pandemic and the looming threat of world war can only be stopped through the global revolutionary struggles of the working class. And I think it's important to understand that what has happened thus far in the first 3.5 years of the pandemic, this has to be seen as a warning. We now know that in case a far more dangerous variant evolves, or if there's another spillover event which causes another pandemic, that the ruling elites will not take even the most minimal measures which were done at the start of the pandemic. And I think really, the most sort of the fundamental significance of this book and the coming volumes that we're working on is really that they trace the political, economic, social, and scientific development of the pandemic, and they draw out the key political lessons at each stage. And this really is an indispensable tool to educate and develop socialist consciousness within the working class to prepare for the coming struggles. And I think the pandemic really amounts to a monumental social crime, and those responsible must and will be held accountable. And it's intimately the study of this book by workers, by young people, is really deeply connected to the fight to develop the Global Workers' Inquest into the pandemic, which the WSWS launched in November 2021, which really it remains the only independent investigation into the crimes that have been committed globally during the pandemic. So I'll conclude there. I just encourage everyone to everyone that's here in person and watching online to purchase the book, to study it carefully, and to participate in the inquest, and then to draw the necessary conclusions from this experience. And I would second what Dave said. I would encourage everyone here to join the SEP, to take up the fight for socialism and the fight for global elimination, which we now know can only be achieved under a world socialist society. So thank you.